All right, hello everybody. We're going to go ahead and talk about classical China today. In our class before, we've discussed Shang China. I'm going to review that a little bit, but the majority of our discussion today is going to be around the Zhou Dynasty. And this dynasty actually predates what you're looking at on the screen, which is the Great Wall of China. This doesn't come until about 700 years later under the Han Dynasty, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Let's actually first going on to the next slide. This is just a simple way for you to get to know each of the dynasties. This is something we will refer to as well. So right now we're focusing on Shang, Zhou, Qin, and Han. So if we're going to sing the song, it's Shang, Zhou, Qin, Han, and then we would go through the rest of the song. This is a great way to remember the timeline, and we'll continue to go through this. So today, again, just a reminder, we're going to focus on Shang and Zhou, China. So when we're looking at the Shang Dynasty, notice the date, 1600 BCE. This is around the same time when a lot of the river civilizations are declining, and China is no exception in this regard. And really, when we're looking at the Shang Dynasty, it's really this ability here among the Yellow River. And so in this regard, they're really developing very similarly to Mesopotamia and Egypt as well. And so with the Shang Dynasty, the main thing you need to understand is it's the first documented rule within China. We see the origins of Mandarin Chinese, and we really see the Chinese culture start to develop. And the way we substantiate this in history is we make sure that this is the Shang Dynasty that comes after the Qia Dynasty. Now, we do have evidence of the Qia Dynasty with archaeological evidence, but we can't read the writing from that dynasty, and some historians even debate whether or not the Qia Dynasty did exist. But Shang understand the documentation, and really what we see is it's coming out of the Wanghe River, Yellow River civilization here, and then really the most important thing about the Shang Dynasty is compared to Mesopotamia and Egypt and even the Indus Valley, all three of those civilizations were trading with each other, but China was isolated and did not actually trade with others, partly because they are so far away from other cultures. But understand that the ability of the Chinese to create and sustain agriculture without any technological exchange between the other cultures is very important and really shows the tremendous ability of the Chinese to develop as a civilization, especially within isolation. Now, what we'll see going into the Zhou Dynasty is the ever-present dynastic cycle, and we call this the mandate of heaven. And so really how this starts is, so we're looking at new dynasty becomes old dynasty. So people start by being upset with the current emperor. There are too many taxes. The emperor is not necessarily taking care of them. There's peasant uprisings. There may be people from outside that are trying to destroy things. So ultimately, we have a new emperor that comes in. So the new dynasty is founded by having an emperor restore peace and really come into favor with the people, and their justification for rule is saying that the gods, the heavens, want me to rule, and I have the permission to rule. That goes pretty well for a while, and then ultimately things start to break down as far as the taxation. And then I mentioned before with the revolts from within, invaders from the outside, and then oftentimes the government's inability to deal with a natural disaster. And so over time, while the dynasties can be strong, eventually they will fall out of favor with the Chinese people, and then you will see a new person come in. And so really what we're looking at here is it could potentially be a similar comparison to divine rights of kings that we'll see in Western Europe later on. But this concept is really substantiating the power of the emperor. And this is something that will continue throughout the entirety of our study of Chinese history. Okay, so finally now we're here. We're in the Zhou Dynasty. Notice the date, 1029, which is very similar to the other dates when classical civilizations start. This is true about Greece. This is eventually true about Rome. And we also see this in the Indus Valley. And so the Zhou Dynasty is really where we see Chinese culture begin to take off. And so understand that the mandate of heaven is seen with Wu Wang taking over with the Shang Dynasty. And so the Shang Dynasty is seen as inefficient, ineffective, and so Wu Wang takes over as the first Zhou emperor. And importantly, what we see as a change in culture is you see a lot of expansion of the territory into the Yangtze River. And ultimately, this is important because it's very rich in agriculture. So the Greeks didn't really care as much about agriculture. It's different within the Chinese culture. And so, really, the importance of the Zhou Dynasty is they're able to reunite, or I should say, unite for the first time North and South China. And so now, if you're living in China, you can have wheat from the north, rice from the south. And this is ultimately a very important part of building Zhou China, especially with the population as well. Now, we do see a change in culture. Ultimately, during this time, we do see some standardization happening. So, we promote one standard spoken language, which is Mandarin Chinese. The books are also written in Mandarin Chinese. This is the language of the government as well. And really, what we're seeing is there's a greater emphasis on military and less on intellect. And that will change going forward because the Chinese don't necessarily favor the military in a general sense. There's really other things that are more important, like a well-run government and things like that. But ultimately, what we see are things do change a little bit. In the Shang Dynasty, you would see things like human sacrifice. This is no longer something that would have been used in the Zhou Dynasty. Now, the Zhou Dynasty is what we credit with creation of the mandate of heaven. And again, think of the mandate as just permission from the heavens. And so really the different dynasties would use this to justify their rule based on the idea that the heavens had transferred power of the dynasties and they legitimize the current dynasty. But eventually the heavens would become displeased with a poor leader and the dynasty would be overthrown. So this cycle, the mandate of heaven, we first see when we get to the Zhou dynasty. Now, looking at this from a government standpoint, the original system is decentralized. It's very difficult to unite China under one single ruler, and ultimately the best effective way to kind of control the different areas in China is we use a feudal system. So what we see are you would have the ruler, so the emperor in this regard would give land to the most important people or allies within his government, and they would give land, and on this land they would be charged to protect it for the emperor, and they would run the land. But all of this, understand, is based on loyalty. And so really we use the feudal system because it's the easiest way to make sure everyone is involved. But if your loyalty breaks down, if people are unsatisfied with what's going on, then it's going to fall apart. So in the ideal world is the emperor gives people land, and then they'll tax the people living on the land. They'll use the taxes to create military troops, and the military troops would effectively protect the people. But unfortunately, because the empire got so large and you don't have transportation like in Rome or Persia, communication breaks down and ultimately it's unstable. People stop being loyal, and really it totally falls apart. And this is ultimately the last time we will see a very decentralized China run by an emperor. So when you think of the Zhou Dynasty, remember that it is decentralized. And a lot of this too, going into the next era, is eventually it's going to fall in this era of the warring states. And this is very important. I would put a star next to that. And so really what we're looking at is the era of warring states shows the mandate of heaven. The Zhou Dynasty is falling out of favor with the Chinese people. And really what we see is the regional rulers did not believe that the actual emperors were doing what they were supposed to. And so the emperors basically form independent armies and break away. So instead of having an emperor and then people who are loyal to the emperor, you have these people who were loyal making essentially their own countries. And so the whole system just falls apart. So where do we go from here? Well, we have all this chaos, and ultimately philosophers are trying to study the chaos. Why are things going poorly? What can we do to improve them? And so you have people like Confucius, who is really trying to study and figure out what can we do to restore order, to restore peace, and essentially restore the mandate of heaven here. And so ultimately what we see is Confucianism, and then another study which we'll look at is legalism, ultimately helps to reunify China and get rid of this era of warring states, which is total discord, and trying to make sure this comes back. So understand with the weaknesses of feudalism, if it's decentralized, it can be effective in controlling a large government. However, at a certain point, it does break down. And really, because of the lack of communication and roads, despite a similar language, there's different dialects, and then there's different customs within each area as well. And so really, this era sort of ends with nomadic invasions and the emperor failing to restore this. And so we show our first official cycle of the mandate of heaven. We will continue on with the Qin Dynasty in our next lecture, and please email me with any questions that you do have.